Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you all at the Institute for European Studies, also on behalf of the Egmont Institute, at this kickoff of our new lecture series on the future of European geostrategy. You may ask yourself the question why we have decided to tackle this particular theme in the course of 10 evening lectures. And the very short answer to that question is, well, essentially, the organizers cannot help but experience a feeling that we live in turbulent times and that Europe finds itself on the edge of a precipice. In many ways, instability is popping up on the various corners around the European periphery, and inside Europe there is also an ever more heated debate taking place over the future of European integration, or some even suggest the possibility of European disintegration. From that perspective, the overall purpose of this lecture series is essentially to reflect upon the exercise of power by Europe on the international stage. So, if you will, the overarching aim is to do so through a geographical prism. The compass that you see on the cover of the flyer and here as well on the screen is not a coincidence. We essentially aim to look in all directions the wind may blow over the course of the coming weeks. East, south, southeast, north, far east, west, and so on. You may also notice that the compass on the photograph is not pointing north, which can be read in different ways. Being academics, we can of course not avoid also asking the fundamental questions of what is actually the present state of European foreign policy, what is the present condition of European cohesion as an enabler of European foreign policy, and what is, if you will, the big picture analysis when it comes to geopolitics and strategy in Europe. Now, to kick off this exercise, it is my great pleasure to introduce Robert Cooper on the phone. As he dislikes having long CVs read aloud, I shall make use of this opportunity to do so without him hearing me, but he has the microphone on, so that complicates life, of course. Well, Robert Cooper is at present a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, and many of you may also know of him as a very distinguished diplomat serving in the British Foreign Office, including as a long-time advisor to then British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Robert Cooper also joined the Council Secretariat of the European Union in 2002, where he headed the DG for External Relations and Politico-Military Affairs, DG E8 for the connoisseurs of the European institutions. And in that capacity, Robert had quite a bit to do with the drafting of that document that we used to call the European Security Strategy. And then afterwards, as the European External Action Service was set up, he also became a counsellor to Lady Ashton, giving some advice, I presume, on how the shop should be set up and run. Robert Cooper is also a very prolific author on foreign policy. He wrote a book called The Breaking of Nations, Order and Chaos in the 21st Century. It was published just over 10 years ago, as well as a very influential and to some extent controversial essay entitled Liberal Imperialism, which appeared in several versions between 2002, 2005, if I'm not mistaken. All texts that I read as an avid student of European foreign policy, as a postgraduate student myself. In any case, in the past 10 years, it seems that the breaking of nations has been, by and large, on the rise. And liberal imperialism has, at least in some ways, been on the retreat. So I think it is a perfect opportunity to ask ourselves the question where we stand at the present moment. It is therefore my pleasure to pass on the floor to Robert Cooper to give us an update, and I would like to remind all of you to switch off your phones if you haven't done so already.
That probably includes me.
Yeah. Correct. And you can leave your phone switched on if that is in silent mode, because we're here on an on the record session, so you're free to tweet using the hashtag that is also beamed on the screen. Without further ado, Robert, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't mind. I don't mind being quoted or even tweeted. Particularly, I don't mind being tweeted because I've never looked at Twitter, so I'll never know. The only thing I would say is I would hope that anybody who wants to repeat something I say will understand the spirit in which it's said, because sometimes things are said as a joke, and if you write them down as though this is a serious statement, then you get in trouble. Like, for example, I was thinking when I forget his name, the kind person who introduced me with all of these. When you said, when you referred to the subtitle of the book, Order and Chaos in the 21st Century, I thought to myself, yes, well, that actually, in a way, describes my diplomatic career quite well. Because first I worked at the Foreign Office, which was extremely orderly, and then I came to work for the European Union, which was much more chaotic. But the European Union is much more fun. That's the bit of... the Foreign Office is absolutely superb, fantastic organization. Once, actually, when David Miliband became Foreign Secretary, he asked one or two people to give their views on the Foreign Office. And I wrote something saying that I thought of all the organizations I'd seen, and indeed, with the exception, I think, of the State Department, which is in a different class, of all of the foreign services I'd had any acquaintance with, I thought that the British Foreign Office was really one of the best, maybe the best. Terrific people, extreme, notable for its extremely good esprit de corps, but some really brilliant, intelligent, enterprising people. The funny thing is that on almost all of the big decisions that needed to be made in the last 50 years, except for one, perhaps, Britain was wrong. The European Union, on the other hand, is a muddled, chaotic organization. But I don't think the results are as bad as you would always expect. Sometimes, like, I think the Aristotelian definition of virtue is quite good, but avoiding extremes is a good thing to do. And the European Union usually manages to do that, because usually, and we are a plural society, usually there are lots of different opinions about what one should do. There are people who think one should take drastic, dramatic action, and there are people who think you should do nothing. And usually the European Union ends up doing something between the two. And it's not necessarily wrong. At least in one concrete case I'm thinking of, I think it was probably the best thing to do, rather than to be as tough as the toughest or as soft as the softest. So I come back to Brussels with kind of a certain nostalgia and affection, although it was also sometimes a frustrating place to work for as well. But if you just think back a little bit about I think the edge of the precipice was the phrase that was used. Well, yes, but that's a whole lot better than being over the precipice. If you think back at the history of Europe over the last 50 years, well, let's say it's more than that now. If you think since the war, it was really a mess at the end of the war. The place was flooded with refugees and with armies. There was constant tension. There were 5 years really of, well, no, it's not really 5, it's about 3 years of discussions among the great powers about what to do with Germany, which ended in no agreement at all. And as a result of that, there was tension over Berlin very regularly all the way through until the Berlin Agreements in 1970. But meanwhile, there was a Soviet occupation and an enormous amount of repression going on in Eastern Europe. There were threats to Turkey. There was a civil war in Greece. There was a major economic crisis in the immediate post-war period, and then you go through the successive decades after that, and you find all kinds of tragedies and stupidities going on through each decade. In the 1950s, it's the French in Vietnam and then Algeria. It's the British in Suez. It's the messy decolonizations in Britain. There's also there was also the confrontation going on in Malaysia, Indonesia. There's the Korean War. There's the revolution in China, making China most fantastically difficult to deal with. Decolonization in India brought enormous bloodshed. And thinking of post-colonial bloodshed, you have the same theme running through relations with Cyprus. I could probably go on for 2 hours on all of the bad things that happened during this period. But the funny thing is that at the end of it, it's not so bad. At least compared with the 1950s, I've never served in an army. The idea that somebody should reintroduce. I think now there are 4 states in Europe that still, in the European Union, that still have conscript armies. At the end of the war, I think all European states had conscript armies. That also tells you something about the change that's taken place. So, although it's always possible to be pessimistic about the immediate future, when you look back at what's happened over the long period, I think the result is much, much better than anybody could possibly have hoped in the years 1945 to 50. It should be said that this, well, 2 things should be said. The main thing that should be said is, if you want to find one single cause for this, the answer is actually the United States of America. At the end of the war, the United States was really the only country left standing, and it was the policies adopted by the United States that were the the major influence on what happened in Europe since. There were some extraordinarily intelligent European actions as well, of which the Schuman Declaration and what followed from it is the most intelligent of all. But that would never have happened without backing from the United States. And in all of these things, the United States has been the guardian angel of Europe over this period. If we come to today, it's true that I think the world looks quite a lot more difficult than it did 10 years ago. We are now surrounded, it seems, by problems. Some of these have been latent all along. The Maghreb has never been a success story. The Middle East has always been a place of unresolved problems. In both areas, these seem to be particularly acute. And on the other side of the Maghreb, we have countries in Africa now in a different kind of crisis in West Africa with the Ebola virus. But all of these, on all sides, we are surrounded by weak states. And two things which seemed rather safe and predictable over the bulk of the period that I'm talking about have become less predictable. One, of course, is Russia, which has become very sharply unpredictable. I don't know of anybody who really predicted the Russian seizure of Crimea. And the other, in a different way, is America. America has always been unpredictable in some degree. It's usually it's done many things that it didn't predict itself. Woodrow Wilson didn't fight the election that brought him back to power in 1914, was it? I'm not sure of that date. Or 1916. He didn't fight it on the proposal that he was going to become involved in World War I. Roosevelt fought the election in again, I know it must be 1940, fought the election again on precisely on the theme of not becoming involved in World War II, and both of them did. So there is an unpredictable element in US policy. But at the moment, I think that unpredictable element has a bigger strategic dimension, because now Europe is no longer the strategic center of the world, as it undoubtedly was really from 1945 until 1989. And now what Russia is doing matters very deeply to people in this continent. It's certainly of great concern to the USA, but it's not really a global challenge. Russia is no longer a global power. It's a global power in military terms, at least particularly as far as nuclear weapons are concerned. But it's not a global threat. Russia, the Soviet Union, was a global threat because it had a global ideology which was at the time very attractive and was attractive. In some ways, you could say it was attractive objectively, because the 1930s had seen what looked like the collapse of capitalism, and then that was followed by the capitalists fighting each other, exactly as predicted by communist writers. And there were acutely dislocated societies in which communism might seem like an attractive alternative. And indeed, there were communist parties elected immediately after the war. So communism was a serious global force in the immediate, at the beginning of the 1950s. That's no longer the case. In fact, Russia has abandoned communism. So if there is and this is not a global threat, this is now a major regional problem. Does it matter to the United States? Yes, it does. But is it a threat directly to the United States? No. It's a threat to the world order that the United States has helped create, and happily they still take it seriously. But that is no longer guaranteed, and Europe ought to be doing more to be ready to look after itself. I don't think the United States is going to abandon Europe, but I doubt if it is going to be ready to act if Europe itself does nothing. And clearly there is China, about which I won't say very much. But clearly, if there is something that looks like a threat, again, I don't think directly to the United States, but looks like a threat to peace and stability and order, and a growing threat rather than a declining one, that's China rather than the USA. So I think that the EU now needs to be more serious, more active, more thoughtful about foreign policy than was perhaps required before. But coming back to what I said a couple of minutes ago, we're surrounded by weak states. And the crises that we have are crises of, in many cases, of legitimacy, which is really the most acute form of weakness, but they're all crises of weakness. What Russia has done in Ukraine is a reflection on the mess that Ukraine is in. The Arab Spring was a revolt of the people against some illegitimate states, but you don't produce strong, stable states instantly. Indeed, revolutions normally produce chaos. So on every side we have weakness, much more acute, I think, than we've ever had before. The real phenomenon of the 20th century, which is why I may have grimaced a little at the reference to an article called Liberal Imperialism. This is a very strange article. It's the one thing that I actually didn't really write myself, because I was fantastically busy at the time. Somebody rang me up and said they wanted to publish an article. Would it be okay if they took some things I'd written in different places and put them together? And that was what they did. And I said, okay, anything to get them off the phone, so I could do whatever it was. I can't remember what it is, but I can only tell you that the bit that is always quoted in this article is about the only bit that I didn't write. I say some other things in other places, and I also would have been, I think, pretty cautious about the title Liberal Imperialism, because if you ask me what happened in the 20th century, the answer is the major event in the 20th century was the death of imperialism. At the beginning of the century, the world was covered in empires. At the end of the century, in 1989, the last of the big empires breaks up. The trouble with empires is you only know that it's an empire after it's broken up. Maybe if Scotland had broken away from the UK, everybody would have said, well, of course, that was really just a rather long-running colonial situation. I don't think that people in Britain in the 19th century thought of Ireland as being a kind of colonial situation. That's what it really was. As I say, we only know when it's broken up. But what happened in the 20th century was that the empires broke up, and that is, and that's one of the causes of the weak states, because states are not easily made at all. If you look at European history, you find that it really takes a very long time. People start with the Treaty of Westphalia normally, but actually the states had started long before that. And they're still changing shape until the beginning of the 20th century. So we ought not to be surprised if this process is accompanied by turbulence. And the real surprise has been the success of Central Europe. By no means complete, but there are still a lot of room for improvement, but that's true of Western Europe as well. But the real thing that we ought to be surprised at and admire was the way in which the countries of Central Europe have, on the whole, turned out to be not so badly governed and not so unstable. And for countries escaping from some kind of colonial occupation, that's actually quite remarkable. It's a tribute to them, and I think it's also a tribute to the framework of European and Atlantic institutions. What should we do? Well, this is a good moment for this university to run its course of lectures on. I don't know why the term is always geopolitics. International politics, maybe. Because when Mackinder invented the term geopolitics, he was referring specifically to the impact of geography on history, on international affairs. But it's a good time for people to think about what strategy should be. There is a change of personnel in Europe, and that's a good moment for people to rethink. And I have a feeling that Mrs. Mogherini may even have said that she would be content with the idea of a strategic review. I wouldn't. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to do, provided if somebody wants to produce a strategy, they understand that strategy is not just a matter of describing the world, nor just a matter of saying what kind of world you want and what you want to do. It's also a matter of saying how you're going to do it. And there is no point in producing a document called security strategy or something like that, unless it tells you something about resources. The document of 2003, maybe, we never gave it the title security strategy because it didn't actually tell you how to do it. But this would be a good time to do that, because it would be a good time to think about where we should put our resources. Maybe I take a 2-minute pause so that people at the back who are standing could sit down, because there are some seats at the front. Why don't you do that? I can take a drink of water. And I can also take the opportunity to say, actually, I'm not planning to talk for 2 hours. I'm now going to say a few slightly more solid things about what I think, what would be on my mind if I were advising a High Representative, and then you'll do the talking, and I'll comment now and then on your criticisms or answer questions or whatever you want to do. But I come back to my theme of the fact that we're surrounded by weak states, and it shouldn't surprise us, because these are mostly new states in some way. And what should you do in those circumstances? I don't think that classical diplomacy is enough. Classical diplomacy was invented among the European states, governments dealing with each other. But these were still governments which were roughly equal and were roughly solid. Richelieu, in his political testament, talks about his policy of continuous negotiation. But actually, if you look actually at what Richelieu was doing, what was going on in France at the time was a major state-building exercise. But continuous negotiation, continuous diplomacy was a sensible theme in Europe at the time. I think we need to be a bit more active than that, because the states that we're dealing with are half-built. You cannot, they are independent states, and that way you have to relate to them as states. On the other hand, they're only half-built, and the most important priority for them, as it was for Europe in the 16th and 17th century, is to build the states. And I think it's in our interests that the states should be built as well. And we need a policy not just of continuous diplomacy, continuous negotiation, I would say of continuous intervention. By intervention, I don't mean military intervention. That's the last kind of intervention. I mean continued activity, where possible with the governments, if the governments want the right thing, work with them. If the governments are no good, then look around for other people to work with. In fact, probably look around for other people to work with anyway. But it's a characteristic of these states that it's not enough just to know what the government is thinking, because that's only one. They're only usually one player in the game. If you're going to act sensibly, you need to know something about the government, about society in general, and about, of course, opposition groups and all of that, because in a weak state, any of these things may be important at any time. So what we need abroad now in the region around us are diplomatic posts which are not passively reporting on what's happening and what threats there are, but are actively looking for opportunities to help the process of building the state. As I say, with the government, if the government wants to and is doing the right thing, by some other means, if not. And if the place is chaotic, probably there are a lot of opportunities. And this should not just be the business, this is not just the business of, certainly not just the business of the External Action Service, because it's also the business of DG Dev, and it's something that DG Trade needs to take account of, and ECHO will be involved as well from time to time. And ECHO, by the way, although it's right to keep what ECHO does in a kind of distinct and ring-fenced area, ECHO actually know an enormous amount about countries because they're getting involved right at the ground level, and they really see the problems, and they're trying to do practical things, and that's the point at which you discover that what the government tells you doesn't actually really happen the way that you think it does, or it's supposed to. So I think that we need posts in these places who bring together information from all kinds of places and from the wide range of European NGOs who are also involved on the ground and who see a different side of life. And the EU delegation should try to bring together all of that, including what the member states are doing. For me, if I was organizing this, I would give an enormous priority to the neighborhood, to ensure that even in places where there didn't seem to be problems, we had posts which were deeply involved. You get to know a country by becoming active in it, not just by kind of sitting and looking. And therefore doing things is always a good way. Then you really find out what works and what doesn't work, which ministries are effective. So, as I said, continuous intervention. I would, on the whole, start with small interventions, and if they work, to do more. Try lots of things, see what works. And don't stick to an agreed formula. I think that that if I get the initials right, DCFTA, is that the correct terminology? DCFTA. I think these are good ideas. And DCFTA for Ukraine is probably extremely useful in the long run for Ukraine, although it'll take some time to get there. But it'll be useful for Ukrainian businessmen who want to sell things in the EU. But this is not the primary problem in Ukraine. The primary problem in Ukraine is corruption. And we ought to be looking, now there is a golden opportunity, we ought to be looking at what can be done with that. That's the great weakness of Ukraine. It costs, I can't remember what the currency is, but I was told 5-point-something million, but it's probably dollars, to get a seat in Parliament. So we ought to be looking at the justice system, and there's an opportunity there's an opportunity for reform. But to know what to do and how to do it and who to do it with is something that can only be done by people on the ground. So this is an opportunity. I think that what I saw of the External Action Service operated a bit the wrong way around. There's a feeling that what matters is Brussels and the delegations are out there. It's the other way around. What matters is the delegations. They're the front line. They're the people. Foreign affairs is about dealing with foreign countries, and knowing what happens in the foreign countries is extremely difficult and extremely important. And acting without understanding who you're dealing with, what effect your actions are going to have. I'm tempted to say bombing campaigns without people on the ground, as an example of this kind of action, is an easy way to get things wrong. Maybe the right thing to do sometimes, but I understand very well why President Obama was so hesitant about the action that the US and others have taken. So there are a whole range of things. The European Union is extremely important for its neighbourhood, particularly for the countries of the Maghreb, and lying behind them as well, Africa as a whole, and for its neighbours to the east and to the southeast. Because there's still a lot of unfinished business in the Balkans. The kind of places that we ought to look at as being relative success stories, and everything in foreign policy is relative, especially success is relative. relative success is the equivalent in foreign policy of a massive triumph. If you get anything that's got the word success in it, you're doing well. So, but everything is I got so absorbed in that subclause that I forgot what I was going to say originally. No, and there's nothing in my notes that reminds me. Maybe I'll come back to it. I was coming back to the thought that what matters is out there rather than Brussels. There are basically there are too few people in the delegations. There are too many people in Brussels. There are too many layers in the Brussels hierarchy. Actually, there's too much hierarchy. What matters in dealing with difficult foreign countries is knowledge, not seniority. There's a tendency to organize bureaucracies on the basis that the more people you have working for you, the more important you are. That probably is true for in some areas. It's, I think, true in the military, for example, some of the time at any rate. Commanding a division is more important than commanding a company. But sometimes we ought to understand that foreign ministries are more like law firms, and it's often the knowledge of the individual that matters rather than the numbers of people that they're responsible for. And a real specialist who knows a particular place in the world extraordinarily well is worth any number of people. This large crisis can be tackled only on a European basis. I'm not sure whether that's going to how well that's going to work or not. It's not automatic that the Council works together or acts together. The incentives, if you're a foreign minister, are not to promote the career and reputation of the High Representative. The incentives are to promote your own career and your own reputation. So there are 28 foreign ministers sitting around the table who would probably all like that to be a good, solid European policy, but what they want even more than that is they want to make a good career. There are people who have, I think, very successfully combined those two tracks. I think of Carl Bildt, for example, who was always a strong advocate of a European line, but nevertheless made a personal impact as well. I think that's what one should hope for in foreign ministers, people who have ideas and energy, who want to make themselves careers, but understand that this can probably be done best through Europe. I think that in the so if I was Mrs. Mogherini, I would have a hard look at the way in which the organization ran. I would take very seriously the proposals made in the letter of instructions from Mr. Juncker about bringing together trade, development, and remaining in close touch with areas like energy as well, because the Commission has enormous resources. If, when Mrs. Mogherini is chairing the Council, people know that it's not just her, but it's actually the collective weight of the Commission and its resources, then she will be that much more effective. If I was the chair of the, for her, I think the agenda will mostly set itself. If I was the chair of the PSC, I would try to focus discussions much more on individual countries. They may be small, but real policy is done in individual countries. I would bring from significant countries, I would bring the EU head of delegation regularly into the PSC to check what's going on, to check what they're doing, and find out what is, where are aid funds being spent, what is the trade policy around, what other interventions are going on. The idea that aid is non-political, maybe you can build a road or a dam or something, maybe that's non-political, but I doubt it, because the road is always built somewhere, and the dam is always built somewhere. Dams are highly political, particularly for the people who live there. And roads, you normally find somebody wants the road because it goes through their constituency or something like that. So everything you do has got some political impact. And these are things which are very non-political. If you're talking about reforming the justice system, which is frequently what people need, then that's much more political. So if I was the chair of the PSC, for key countries, I would really try to get a sense of what the EU was actually doing on the ground, not with intention of micromanaging it, but with the intention of encouraging people to be active, active and imaginative and creative. I think that I'm probably coming about to the end of what to say. I haven't said anything very specific about particular situations. For the Maghreb, I don't know very much about it, so I wouldn't say. And I think that particular knowledge is what matters. As a general policy on the Maghreb, maybe. But actually what really matters is policy on Morocco, policy on Algeria, policy in Libya. But I will say a word about Russia. Here there are lots of there seem to be lots of opinions possible. I think that what Russia has done is outrageous, and that we should not rest until it stops. This is the first case in Europe since the end of the war in which a country has seized territory by force. It's the first case, I think, unless we leave aside the Soviet interventions in the different Warsaw Pact countries, but it's the first case where somebody has sent their army into a neighbor with the objective, I assume, of destabilizing it, if not seizing more territory. This is completely outrageous and unacceptable, and we should continue to oppose it. I think slowly is probably a good way. I don't think there's any reason to rush, but I think we should continually leave the message that this story is not over yet, as far as we're concerned. While Russian troops remain on Ukrainian territory, while the question of Crimea Crimea is illegally occupied, while that situation remains, we should continue doing whatever is required. Over the long term, there's no need to rush to resolve this problem. So let me finish on that, and then I guess either you will go home or we have a discussion.